Live look at the White House on this Saturday afternoon, 2:17 in the nation's capital. President Trump saying on Saturday that the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela should be considered closed in its entirety, but he gave no further details as Washington is ramping up its pressure on President Nicolás Maduro's government in Venezuela. U.S. officials contacted by Reuters were surprised by Trump's announcement, and they say they were unaware of any ongoing U.S. military operations to enforce a closure of Venezuelan airspace. Retired Marine Intelligence Officer, National Security Analyst, and host of the Strat Podcast, Hal Kempfer, still here with me. Hal, it's good to see you. I'm glad you got that itch on your face as we were coming on TV here. Let's talk about no-fly zones. Does the implementation of a no-fly zone to you raise more questions than it answers?
Well, the president of the United States does not issue a no-fly zone over Venezuela. Venezuela is a sovereign country. It controls its own airspace. So it was very interesting. And of course, for me, it's fascinating to see, and this is kind of how President Trump does it. He uses social media to make some of these pronouncements. So it comes out on Truth Social that he's saying this. And so I wasn't, and actually I was, when I heard that, obviously we caught some of our own officials off guard. I wasn't completely surprised that something like that might happen because we don't have a way to impose that. Now, if we're flying military operations, just like when you're doing training out at sea, you put a notice to mariners that you're actually doing a naval exercise or something out at sea. Do the same thing. If you're doing a lot of aviation stuff, you'll put out a notice that you need to avoid this airspace. And if you saw what happened, last June when they had the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, there was a lot of notice to airlines and to avoid certain airspace because of missiles and planes and drones and everything else out there, and they complied. But this really, because this didn't immediately follow a strike, or at least a strike hasn't happened, or strikes haven't happened yet, that there has been no military aviation activity that at least we're aware of, U.S. military activity over Venezuela. This does have a feel to it more of strategic communication in order to put more pressure on Maduro and the Maduro regime, and doing it in a very unusual way by using social media to put this message out there. And of course, that's one of those things is for the airlines, knowing there's a carrier task force sitting off the coast, knowing that there's all this other U.S. military capability sitting right off the coast. When they're told this by the U.S., if they don't want to believe it, their insurance carriers will sure as heck tell them, no, you're not flying. You will not be insured if you fly over Venezuela. And that usually quells their desire to do those flights. And that further isolates Venezuela, and it makes it more difficult for Venezuela to operate as a nation state in the region and around the world. And I think that's part of the purpose there, was to actually put that pressure on them without, and I've seen President Trump do this many times, he'll put something out there, but he didn't actually do anything. He just said something, and then there's a huge reaction on the other end.
So if we talk about what a no-fly zone means, is every no-fly zone the same, Hal? Will the nature of a no-fly zone differ based on what the U.S.'s intentions might be?
Yeah, well, no-fly zone by definition means nobody fly in that zone. And then there's restricted, various other types of restricted aviation or restricted flying zones where they may allow certain things to happen, but other things not to happen. This one's pretty much a blanket, says no fly. All right, nobody's supposed to fly there because it's so hazardous, and that's basically what it's saying. Particularly aimed at civil aviation, particularly aimed at big airliners, stopping them from flying where they have a lot of passengers in the back of the aircraft, and they don't want to put an aircraft like that in harm's way. That's kind of aimed at that direction, and certainly for large cargo aircraft, it would be the same thing. But it also applies to other types of aircraft, small civil aircraft flying around, and actually, though. I'm sure the Venezuelan military would say, well, it doesn't apply to us because it's the president, whatever they want to say. They also will take notice of the fact that if they put anything up in the air, that it would certainly be a much easier to identify it if there's no other clutter in that airspace. And so they realize that by doing this, we have made whatever they're flying at any given time that much easier to identify and acquire as a potential target.
So, this is what the president sent out on social media. You mentioned that he made this announcement online. This is what it said: To all airlines, pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers, please consider the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. Thank you for your attention to this matter. What are examples of other no-fly zones that have had to be implemented either now or in recent history, Hal?
Oh, we've had to do numerous no-fly zones over the Middle East, and of course, if you recall, after 9/11, we did a no-fly zone. Well, it actually we said no-fly, but it was a restricted flights all over the U.S. We put all the airliners on the ground. All right, we put all the civil aviation on the ground, and we kept it that way until we were able to gradually lift it and modify it. But for example, I'm in Southern California. We had a no-fly zone over Disneyland for quite some time. Might still be in effect, and that was a post 9/11 thing. Was don't fly any airliners over Disneyland, and we've done that with a number of places. And if you go around any of the military bases, usually there's restricted flying around the military bases. You're not supposed to, if you're in a small plane or something, you're not supposed to fly it over that military base. I will tell you that when you get around large urban areas, that is a really tough one to enforce because pilots just simply make mistakes and they actually encroach on military airspace. But we have bases out in the desert that we make very clear you do not want to fly there because we have fast moving aircraft doing tactical things, and you need to make sure your airliner or whatever else you're flying is well outside that airspace because there's a definite hazard should you encroach into whatever's going on there.
So let's talk about a story that you and I talked about yesterday, Hal. Let's follow up on that exclusive reporting that the Washington Post had. They said that Secretary Pete Hegseth gave an order to kill everybody in the first strike on a suspected drug boat in the Caribbean back in early September. The Post says after 2 men survived, the mission commander ordered a second strike in order to comply with Hegseth's instructions. Hegseth responding to the report on social media, saying this: as usual, the fake news is delivering more fabricated, inflammatory, and derogatory reporting to discredit our incredible warriors fighting to protect the homeland. As we've said from the beginning, and in every statement, these highly effective strikes are specifically intended to be lethal kinetic strikes. The declared intent is to stop lethal drugs, destroy narco boats, and kill the narco terrorists who are poisoning the American people. Every trafficker we kill is affiliated with a designated terrorist organization. The Biden administration preferred the kid gloves approach, allowing millions of people, including dangerous cartels and unvetted Afghans, to flood our communities with drugs and violence. The Trump administration has sealed the border and gone on offense against narco-terrorists. Biden coddled terrorists. We kill them. Our current operations in the Caribbean are lawful under both U.S. and international law, with all actions in compliance with the law of armed conflict, and approved by the best military and civilian lawyers up and down the chain of command. Our warriors in Southcom put their lives on the line every day to protect the homeland from narco-terrorists, and I will always have their back. Worth mentioning that Hal worked on the war on drugs under U.S. Southcom. Hal, do you still have questions about the order to kill story here? After all, the U.S. captured and released survivors of other strikes since then.
They did, and it's rather interesting. That particular order that you're supposed to go back in and kill survivors of the first strike. Every lawyer would tell you it always depends on the circumstances. But under international law, under the Geneva Convention, there are certain cases where, for example, if someone jumps off an enemy warship and they're in the water, you're not supposed to go out there and machine gun them in the water. Now, there may be tactical circumstances where you cannot rescue them while they're in the water. For example, with submarine warfare in World War I and World War II, they would torpedo a ship, but they would not be in a position to go out there and rescue all the sailors that went in the water once they hit the ship. They had to basically, sink down beneath the waves and hide themselves. And that caused some debate, and that was something that was in the Hague Convention and something they talked about later in the Geneva Convention. So that's an issue. Same thing. For example, I was a paratrooper. I would jump out of aircraft, and as I was parachuting into a potential battlefield, certainly they could turn around and fire at me while I was under canopy. However, if I am a pilot flying a fighter jet and I punch out and I'm under canopy coming in, you're not supposed to shoot the pilot. So it really depends. The idea is that the pilot no longer poses an imminent threat, is no longer, in the fight, so to speak. Whereas I'm as a paratrooper, the moment the whole time, whether before and after I leave that aircraft, I'm a potential combatant or I'm a combatant. So it's a different situation. In this case, there has to be a decision. Were they? I can see where we would not rescue them because we just don't have the assets or resources there. But to go in and target someone who is hapless and just try, basically a search and rescue thing, I think that the lawyers are going to look at that very, very closely, and they're going to try and figure out, was this a violation of international law, the laws of armed warfare? Was this an illegal order? That'll be a big question. I'm sure there are lawyers that will line up and say absolutely not. The way it was done and what was said was not, was probably different than what's being reported. But there will be some that will point and say, well, we don't know, and that will be something that may end up in the courts at some point. They may have to take a look at this much more closely and figure out, was that a lawful order? Did it cross that line?
We have much more to discuss with Hal. Hal's going to stick around for one more segment with us here. We want to discuss the latest on the Russia-Ukraine war. The BBC reporting that more than 600,000 people in Kyiv, in the Kyiv region of Ukraine, were without power on Saturday morning after an overnight Russian attack targeting some of the country's energy infrastructure.